Anna gives a word that that basically describes an individual's situation because of what happened in this colonization and being subjugated by the system. And so as a result of this colonization and this imprisonment, we have there a person. So an anemic person is a socially unstable, alienated person. And then there's the other one, which also describes that person: socially unstable, alienated, and disorganized. So where does this come from? How does a person get into that state of being? And so if you go to the next slide, please, and then we talk about that. So anomie is a sociological, in sociology, anomie is a societal condition defined by an rooting or breakdown of any moral values, standards, or guidance for individuals to follow. Anomie may evolve from conflict of belief systems and causes breakdown of social bonds between an individual and the community, both economic and primary socialization. E.g., good heavens, I got a funny computer here, just excuse me. E.g., alienation in a person that can progress into a dysfunction, dysfunctional inability to integrate within normative situations of their social world, like to find a job, find success in a relationship, etc. Now, just dealing with that, when you look at that, you begin to ask yourself, well, then how then did Aboriginal people integrate into society or attempt to become part of that society that subjugated them? And of course, the answer basically is that I recall when in 1969, when they took away the mission manager from Walgett, and I guess that would be the same with most other places around Australia. Once they took the mission managers away, then all of a sudden, the people who were here were not trained into being able to make their own decisions because someone else had to make their decisions for them. And sort of now, all of a sudden, they have to supply themselves in food because previous to that, what was going on was the white fellas always gave out the rations. And so you had the blankets in the wintertime, you had the blankets in summertime, you had the clothes in wintertime and clothes in summertime. And so these were all supplied to you. Your ability to be able to move around was very restricted. And so because the people had grown up in this and they were born into this type of society, then they had very little knowledge of whether or not what their freedoms were. And on the other side of it, when it came to them going into town and having the ability to be able to freely go into town of their own accord, because we were always 6 miles or something out of town, the position was our people were not prepared nor trained to understand how the white man thinks, how he behaves. We had no idea of what he orders as priority in terms of social norms. And so we had no understanding of that, a lot of our old people. And we only knew what we had, which that people were clinging onto from our own cultural knowledge and cultural background. And so the white people were not prepared for us at this time in 1969. And so we had no measure of our behavior that we had to perform or any expectations that we had. So there was no briefing about that at all. No one was prepared for it. And on the other side of the coin, because the white people felt safe and the blackfellas were out there under control and imprisoned on those missions, they felt safe. But now all of a sudden you've got all these blackfellas who are able to move around and walk around within their society uncontrolled. And then all of a sudden we realized that then the police became much more involved in protecting that white society. And of course, white people still to this day, you know, like you only got to look at the reaction after Mabo. As soon as they realized that blackfellas still had proprietary interests in land, you know, they shit themselves, literally, you know, and then they kept saying to the government, what about our land? What about our backyards? You know, these blackfellas going to come after that. Are they able to take all that off us? So Australia lives with an enormous guilt complex, and they find it very hard to deal with Aboriginal people. every time they see an Aboriginal person on the street, you know, they panic because they don't know how to engage with us. They don't know how to talk to us. And when you talk anything about Aboriginal people, then, you know, they shift the blame and say, you know, well, they're pretty useless mob because they don't get off their ass and they don't do anything and they're welfare ridden. And of course, so they, you know, they feel safe by saying that, and it's putting us to one side. If we go to enemy 2, please. Now, so let's just look at this term here. The term commonly understood to mean, oh wow, I didn't know, funny, this computer again. Yeah, is understood to mean normlessness, is believed to have been popularized by French sociologist Emile Durkheim in his influential book Suicide, 1897. However, Durkheim first introduced the concept of ennui in his 1893 work, The Division of Labour in Society. Durkheim never used the term normlessness. Rather, he described ennui as a derangement. And I'll just get this back again. He talked about ennui as a derangement and an unsatiable will. Durkheim used the term the malady of the infinite, sorry, because desire without limit can never be fulfilled. It only becomes more intense. For Durkheim, ennui arises more generally from a mismatch between personal or group standards and wider social standards, or from the lack of social ethics, which produces moral deregulation and an absence of legitimate aspirations. This is a nurtured condition. Most sociologists associate the term with Durkheim, who used the concept to speak of the ways in which an individual actions are matched or integrated with a system of social norms and practice. Ennui is a mismatch, not simply the absence of norms. Thus, a society with too much rigidity and little individual discretion could also produce a kind of ennui. And of course, when you look at that last part, that's how we were governed on missions. That's how we were controlled. And of course, then all of a sudden, our own mob then just lost that whole sense of, you know, stability within their own society because there was no norms anymore. It was all taken away from us. Our leadership was crippled. And I recall at Walgett, for example, how the old people used to tell us that we used to dance over the back in the sand hills there. They used to walk through the fence and they'd have proper ceremony time. And the white fellas couldn't deal, the white managers could not deal with the singing and the dancing and what appeared to them to be people wailing in those songs. And so they stopped and they brought police out to man the area at these times of the year so that the people couldn't get through the fences anymore and go into the sandhill and do their ceremonies. So they broke down this very social fabric, but maintained a very, very ordered society. And so then all of a sudden, you know, this breakdown, we began to lose our leadership in those communities. And of course, once you lost that leadership, you know, you have a dreadful situation arise where because there are no social norms, because there's no structure or, in place for us, young people are then left to their own imagination as to what to do. Fortunately for a lot of us, you know, we all had the capacity to sort of wander down the river with the old women and do fishing and just sitting on the river listening to the stories. And, you know, getting a feed, because that's what supplemented our food, was to be able to go down the river and catch some fish and go, and us young fellas sneak out to the sand hills and, you know, around Walgett there when we lived on the Namoi River in a camping zone. My aunties, we used to go to the mission all the time and be with them. As young people, we'd sneak onto the mission because we were not supposed to be on there. If they found out that we were on there, well, then they could send the police and the welfare to come and pick us up and, you know, shunt us off to some institution somewhere, just as they did with the Stolen Generation. But we used to go there simply because they were our families on those missions, and we maintained those connections. And of course, our families used to send us to them to make sure they had food, to make sure things were okay. So, and we used to hide ourselves there. Now, if we put up the next one, you begin to understand then some of the complications that occurred. Now, this is a word called solastalgia. It's a relatively new term in psychology, but it describes in the modern era sociological and psychological studies have focused on the impact of mining, and this relates to old white people mostly within the farming area of the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. From these studies, alarm bells rang because of the psychological impact that mining had in respect of changing the local physical landscape. A new concept was finalised called solastalgia. And so if we go to the next slide. Right, definition, right. Solastalgia is a new concept developed to give greater meaning and clarity. Just let me click here again. And clarity to environmentally induced distress, as opposed to nostalgia, the melancholia or homesickness experienced by individuals when separated from a loved home. Solastalgia is distressed. Is the distress that is produced by environmental change impacting on people while they are directly connected to their home environment. Solastalgia is evident in the persistent drought in rural New South Wales and the impact of large-scale open-cut coal mining on individuals in the Upper Hunter Valley of New South Wales. In both cases, people exposed to environmental change experience negative effect that is exacerbated by a sense of powerlessness or lack of control over the unfolding change process. Worldwide, there is an increase in ecosystem distress syndromes matched by a corresponding increase in human distress syndromes. The specific role played by global scale environmental change to sense of place and identity will be explored in future development of the concept of solastalgia. Now, this is an interesting concept because when you look at our society, this is exactly what happened. But you know, they found the need to go out there and do this study amongst old white people and look at how these environmental changes were occurring to their situation, because they lived there all their lives, they used that land, they grew up with it, and their parents and so on since colonization. But you see, nobody bothered to go out and do that, you know, with our mob to see how it impacted us. But this is very descriptive, and it describes exactly what happened to us, the impact of our old people, and this is what's happened is they lost this sense of belonging, and of course watching their environment, and they were powerless to make any significant changes to that, and that had enormous harm on our people, both psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, because their connection is no longer there, and that has some profound impacts on our younger generation, because they started seeing our old people in this state of normlessness and state of hopelessness, and the old ones are frustrated because they want to do things but they couldn't, and they were powerless to change their life circumstances, and because the upper hand was that, you know, they had the police, and the police had the guns, and our experience from the guns was that they just kill you. And if they can't find you, they poison water holes, as they experienced in the north coast of New South Wales, and they just poison you, and you'd find your people laying next to a water hole along the north coast. So they really gave us a horrible time, and those experiences, you know, just transferred from one generation to another. And there are some science now that shows that this trauma can transfer from one generation to the other. And believe it or not, it's through the father. That's what I've learned recently, and that's something we can explore later if you want. Taruna, can you put the next one up, please? So the New South Wales government knew what they were doing. So I put this here because this is what was said in 1943 in a parliamentary debate when they changed the Aboriginal Protection Board Act to the New South Wales Aboriginal Welfare Board. And this is what a bloke called Lieutenant Colonel Bruxner said in Parliament. As late as 1943, the New South Wales government knew of the damage that was being done to Aboriginal people under their statutory authority protectionist regimes. Lieutenant Colonel Bruxner argued in the Parliament that the greatest difficulty, of course, is that the very primitive people are tremendously susceptible to spiritual influence. When they come into contact with the white people, a problem that a large number of us had not understand is immediately created. Bruxner continued. The Honourable, no, it's all right. The Honourable, the Honourable Member for Parramatta, Mr. Golan MP, truly said that when an Aborigine is moved from his own locality, he immediately gets amongst unfriendly spirits. The spirit world is a tremendous force with these people. I have seen Aborigines who have been up almost half the night because of bad dreams. They have been outside their own area in an unfriendly place. One of the greatest problems confronting the department is the settlement of Aborigines where they belong. These people are frequently moved from one district to another so as to give them better conditions. And when we take them away from the place where they are born and reared and where they are expected to be buried, we do them incalculable harm. Now, this is what they knew. They discussed this in the Parliament in New South Wales. And so when we look at our people being shunted from one place to another over the years, yes, of course, there was great trauma, and then the, people throw their hands up in the air and basically gave up, and so the will to fight was no longer there because there was no unity. And when you got into other people's country, well, then of course you don't walk around. That's not the rule in our society. You can't just walk around and shake hand to anybody and say, "Oh, g'day, I'm Gilda. How are you? What's your name? Where are you from?" You can't do that. That was totally forbidden in our culture. When you're in other people's country, you sit, you shut up, mind your own business, and waiting for them to invite you in to participate and become part of their group, and then they'll invite you to talk. These days, you don't give a damn who you are, who you run into. Our people just have lost that sense of responsibility and sense of respect. And of course, because we've been bludgeoned with this white education system to sort of acknowledge and accept the way white people do it. And it's quite embarrassing actually. And I've been in situations where I've gone with blackfellas from Canberra into communities in different places. Back in the late 70s. And these fellas get out of the motor car and walk up and shake hands. I'd sit in the motor car and wouldn't get out of the bloody car because that's not the norm. And I was lucky because I was learning business anyway, through proper men business. And so you get to understand that that's not the way you do things. And then my old fellows who used to be sitting over there on the side watching, they'd come across and ask me who I was because they'd see me sitting in that motor car and then they'd invite me out of the car. And that's the proper way of doing things. And of course, because we lost this sense of normlessness within our society, then that sort of has enormous psychological impacts on us because we don't know who we are, we don't know where we fit. And of course, we adopt these strangers' ways of doing things. And of course, what we don't realize is that what was our background and how did they shut us down? And that takes me to the next slide. So if we go to the next slide, please. So there's this thing called criminalising otherness. Now, criminalising otherness is about the intolerance of difference. We constantly hear from non-Aboriginal Australians that there is no room for otherness, that is, language, culture, or spiritual belief, each of which unsettles non-Aboriginal Australians because they fear otherness. If they can't control it, they want it policed in very strong terms. Kerry Carrington looked in detail at the death of Mark Quayle in Wilcannia and concluded, from a sociological perspective, every white in Wilcannia could be regarded in some sense culpable of creating the context in which Mark died, although some much more consciously than others, by participating in daily racial division in the town, which normalised the mistreatment of Aboriginal people as a natural, justifiable or inevitable. The law enforcement agencies, the Hospital Board and the local Chamber of Commerce are the institutions which have to bear particular responsibility for fueling and maintaining racial inequality in the town. The historical nature of racial division in the town normalises practices based on racism daily. Routine encounters expected between blacks and whites. Mark Quayle was the hapless victim of such deep entrenched disregard for Aboriginal well-being. The horrifying spectacle of racial hatred is normal in Wilcannia. It happens every day. And this is what's happening around the country. And of course, we have to look at those definitions there because this is how they broke us down. And these are, so if you're looking at it from a sociological point of view and you're looking at it from an educational point of view, this is the track that one has to follow because then you get a bit more understanding of that helplessness and hopelessness that still, pervades our community. And we have a responsibility to try and make those changes. And how we make those changes is to understand that these things happen. And we have to get into a position where you as students who are going down this road have to understand that the well-being of human is also about human nature as well, and understanding that people who come from a very different culture, we have built within us an understanding of who we are. That's just who we are. That's just in our DNA. And so within that DNA, we know that we belong to this land. Now, quite frankly, I'm giving a lecture on Aboriginal Day or Aboriginal Week on this thing about what they call always was, always will be. And I asked the question in my head, do our young people truly know what that means? Yeah. Do they really understand the significance of what we're saying? Do they truly understand what it is when we say sovereignty never ceded? Yeah. And what does that do? And I know that when I used to go home from Walgett, and we had the Black Power movement functioning in Australia, in Sydney at the time, and we were very vocal, and we were pretty brave young people, I must admit, all fresh out of high school when we hit Sydney in the late 60s and early 70s. And quite frankly, those of us who took this on, and I must admit there was only about 8 really serious people who took it on. And of course, Paul Coe was one of them, and Isabel, his sister, who's passed on, she rest in peace. But we didn't care. We just said, we have a job to do. We come from, a community that's been subjugated, and we have the capacity to make changes or make our voices heard. And we needed to stop this. And so these experiences that I just described to you, we wanted to make those changes, and we wanted meaningful changes. And as learning in those high schools how to think like a white man, we use those gifts of learning that white man's ways and then use that against him. Yeah. Too many of our people now have been caught up in the gift of the white man. And there's, Australia is a country where the land that's been granted to people is based on a word called socage, S-O-C-A-G-E. And that's because you get gifts given to you for performing for the crown, for the sovereign. And so when you do the right thing by them, then you get all sorts of awards. And that's why I don't like these gifts of awards for, things that are happening, because, if you don't do it for your people, you know, well, then you're not looking for rewards. You're looking to bring about change, and you don't want to be sucked into their realm of you know, developing these grandiose ideas of your own person, when in fact there's a bigger job out there to do, and we have an enormous struggle to go on. And of course, uh, education is great if you use it the right way. If you use it for yourself, well then good, you know. You lose, and in my opinion, I'm being very hard here, you lose the right to talk for Aboriginal people if you don't go back and use your education for their benefit. I know a lot of people in our community who got very well educated, and now have doctorate degrees and all that sort of thing. They talk about what they learn in books as opposed to going back to their own mob and sitting down on the ground and saying, you know, well, okay, what's the situation, current situation, and let's have a look at that. And unfortunately, they don't look at that past history, because the past history of what I just read to you and just went through with you dictates the type of life that we lead now, and people don't understand how that works. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with people who have been savaged by colonialism, and being whipped and tortured in the way in which we have been, I think we need to look very closely at how we can change those things. And quite frankly, you can't do it from a, you know, urban setting. You have to get back into country, on country, with people and understand the situation, and be committed to that. And the changes have to be made out there where we come from. The changes can't be made from sitting in an office. And so we have a big challenge ourselves, within ourselves, to really get back there and do the things that has to be done. And I think we have capacities. I think we all have capacities, and you guys are certainly going to have wonderful capacities, because you know you're going down this road with Taruna and learning all this stuff. And previous to that, whatever you learned from your parents and other people. But you also have to understand that there's a thing called intergenerational trauma, and it's very hard to get rid of unless you work on it. It won't go away by itself. It will stay there. It's unfortunately part of our DNA, and we have to change that whole system. We have to give people hope. So I'll leave it there, Taruna, and we'll let them ask questions.